What's up, guys?
Hey, we're
Hello, hello,
live.
and back.
Episode 13, I believe, Brian, you said, right?
1-3. How about that?
Man,
We're
that's
we're
awesome.
still on a roll.
That's right.
Flying.
Got our consistency going, and we got something going. How about that?
Crazy
We
to
got
Exactly.
some
think we're
interesting
13
interesting
deep at this
topics.
point. Yeah,
Yeah, we're officially a teenager, right? Is that the cutoff now? Is that
yeah.
how that works?
What is that about? Half a year if we're doing it bi-weekly. So we're getting there. Maybe a quarter of a year. So yeah, we're getting
Yeah,
up there.
not too shabby.
Mm-mm.
So, Brian, I think we had a couple interesting topics you found for us to kind of review this week.
Yeah. So the first one was an article on ZDNet that just talked about how fast passwords leak on the web and how fast they go get tested by hackers. So that's an interesting one. And then the second article that we can cover and talk about is about the FBI selling phones to organize crime, and then all the messages and stuff that they read from there. So very interesting topics for today for us to cover.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of a change up from our ransomware conversations, but on to another topic that I think is near and dear to our hearts is MFA, 2FA, it's a conversation we have almost every day now. I mean, even with customers and non-customers, right? So I think it's a pretty important topic for us to kind of review. Let me kind of quiz you guys a little bit. So kind of going back to your CISSP days, and we kind of talked about multi-factor, two FA. You guys remember kind of like what they are? It's something right? Is one of them. You guys remember the other two,
What, something you have?
right?
Mm-hmm. Then also something you are.
Right. Yeah. So those are kind of like those three kind of core things that typically make up a MFA or kind of two-factor process, if you will. So it's not just obviously the thing which would be like your password, and something you have could be like your smart token on your phone or authenticator applications and things like that. And then obviously something you are would be your fingerprint or palm scan, depending on classified data centers and what you're getting into and things like that. So I think it's kind of important for people just to know, what kind of typically makes up that, little triangle, if you will, of what the factors are. Another one I've seen a lot would be like someplace you are, right? So like location type based things. But I think we all know that that can easily be spoofed and tricked and things like that. So Brian,
Yeah,
what
the
were some
whole
of the stats you
conditional
saw
access.
on some of those, like after someone compromises a password, how fast were you seeing before it was actually being tried and tested against the actual accounts?
Yeah, so it's very interesting here. So the article talks about half of the accounts were accessed within 12 hours of them seeding out the credentials. 20% were accessed within an hour. 20%.
That's
And then
crazy.
40% were within 6 hours. So the mind blowing thing to me is like, with AI and machine learning and scripting and Python and Google Go and all that type of stuff, like you would think they automate this stuff, right? But what I really learned from this is that they're still doing it manually, right? Like they actually go in and try those accounts to log in, because I figured they would manually or automate that process, get the hit, and
Right.
then come back and then go for their attack. But that's not how they're doing it. They want to get in, and if they get in, they're going sleuthing immediately into that environment, and then it's just too late. By the time you get that alert that the dark web has whatever on you, like I know I get these alerts all the time that something's
Right.
been breached or whatever, and I just laugh because I'm like, yeah, I just assume it's all out there. But
Right.
yeah, it's just mind blowing how fast that this is going down.
Yeah, it definitely speaks to the urgency that hackers are operating. Lead time after a compromise is pretty short. So if you don't have those mitigating controls in place, damage can occur, very quickly before you even realize that a compromise has happened. I think that's also another one of the unspoken benefits of MFA2 is when somebody does try to access your account, if they do have the credentials, it actually alerts you, right? It lets you know that it prompts you for your token. It has you confirm, and that in and of itself is an indicator of compromise.
Yeah.
And I know we beat the Colonial Pipeline thing up to death or whatever, but I saw the CEO was talking in front of Congress, and it was a password that was compromised, right? And so it's those type of things. Like there was no multi-factor behind the password, and it was easy to get in. And then I go back to my IT director days and think about, well, how many times did we have some type of backdoor in so that we could get into the system? And then that's just sitting there waiting to get exploited, right? Like another VPN profile that doesn't have multi-factor enabled on it. So in an emergency, we could jump in and get on the system, or it's at some DR facility or DR site, or now it's the cloud, right? Like you have all these point-to-point VPNs that you set up between your local data center and the cloud. So maybe you're not doing the multi-factor up in the cloud, but you are on your local VPN. Well, there's a loop around that, right? And those attackers will find that.
Yeah, there's always like this balance, it seems like. I mean, like you bring up a great point, Brian, is like, if I kind of go back to my, network engineering days, I was always like this battle almost of like, the security team wants to make it hard with obvious reasons, and the network team wants to make things easy, for their life to manage and deploy switches or whatever. So you kind of have some of these, somewhat kind of hidden, kind of almost, IT backdoors, but if those get compromised, and they typically have full access or full reign. And, even comes back to our conversations, which we talk about is like segmentation, hey, making sure things are really locked down to where if someone does get into some entry point or kind of hidden entry point, we want to make sure that, things aren't getting, sliced up and, you have kind of full reign. So, it's also, like I said, making sure that multi-factor, whatever it might be, is, across the board and not just like on some devices. Like, if you kind of MFA your Office 365, great, but you don't MFA your, ER system or HR systems or whatever, then it's like, well, like what's the point? It's kind of almost, it has to be all or nothing in my opinion, right?
Yeah, I think orgs are always or often just looking at their critical accounts that maybe host their critical data, but secondary or non-primary accounts should be considered when implementing MFA, because they can, if that account can be used as a chain attack to gain access to other accounts with more sensitive data, like Derek was kind of mentioning, maybe they have like a non-critical GitHub, but it happens to contain hard-coded private keys for a more sensitive service, maybe an AWS service. You've just created an attack chain based on a lower privileged application that just so happened to have data or access to a more critical application. And so auditing that chain and the containing data within your secondary or non-critical assets is just as important. And so that's where things like IAM systems or account federation systems can come into play and provide organizations with a lot of the tools they need to centrally manage these components.
Yep, definitely. And it's always that edge case that somebody finds that you don't put behind that system that you get busted on.
Yeah, exactly. So let me ask you guys your opinion. Like at this point, in today's kind of digital age, do you just assume like passwords are useless and like that's not even like a factor anymore? It's almost zero factor authentication.
I think that's a fair assessment, to be honest. Like I sat in a demo once where the presenter put their password up on the PowerPoint slide and said, okay, go break into my account, right? And he gave the link to log into their email. And so he had the multi-factor with the push authentication turned on. And he's like, see, you can't get in unless I click OK, right?
Right. Yeah, I think it's really going to depend on, I guess, the level of hygiene per individual or organization, and I guess the surrounding controls. If you don't have something like MFA on, or you don't have locking and monitoring on, or maybe your account federation structures messed up and permissions are all janked, then yeah, having a password can certainly help. A strong password can help, but ultimately, if they're able to compromise that, and you have all of these other controls in place, it's going to be very difficult for any attacker to leverage your account for any other kind of compromise, whether it be a chained attack like through social engineering or through direct compromise of the account or of the application itself. So while I wouldn't say don't go I wouldn't say go set your passwords to, simplistic 5-letter characters. I would still stick to NIST standards. You have a great point in that if you think that is the single factor that will prevent an attacker from compromising your account, then you would be mistaken. Yeah, it's the combination of these controls that will really protect your accounts.
Yeah, definitely. I see. Rick here brings up two quick good notes. One is like one of my favorite sayings is really MFA all the things. I think that's a big one. And then also his point about auditing, right? So making sure that nobody can kind of go and create their own accounts and create kind of backdoor authentication mechanisms as well. We've seen that being a challenge in the past, right? Where either SIM swapping is involved or whatnot, and some of these things can get very sophisticated. Depending on their target. So yeah, it's really just not just MFA, but also the whole identity and account creation needs to kind of be looked at holistically. And are there dead accounts? Are there names that don't exist? And that kind of constant single source of truth on accounts and auditing and everything is this cycle of security. But again, this is one I think key step that is pretty much just standard issue right now.
Yep. Well, the self-enrollment can be an issue too, right? You set it up and then the users never come enroll. So then it's easy for the attackers to go enroll themselves at that point. So I think that's a great point as well.
Yeah, and in general, you guys kind of are touching on a topic that I think often gets overlooked with organizations, because they often believe that if their infrastructure is primarily SaaS-based, that they don't have any kind of responsibility over the security of the systems or applications itself. And this is honestly a misunderstanding because contracting organizations are still responsible for the GUI components, the API layer, and maintaining liability over the contained data itself. And so as a result, elements like identity, credential, access management are often overlooked. So it's not only it's important to have these controls, but you should seek to assess the current risk of your SaaS applications through either something like a security control review, even a security assessment or pen test of sorts, at a very minimum against testing frameworks. The known testing frameworks like the OWASP Application Security Verification Standard. And in doing so, you're actually thereby mitigating a lot of the things that often get overlooked when contracting third-party vendors. It's often just pushed onto the rug of the third party and forgotten, and therefore that I think that's why you see a lot of these compromises lead to chained compromises after once an account has been taken over.
So I have one more quiz question for you guys. I actually looked this up before we started, so I don't know if it's 100% accurate, but I'm going to go with it. You guys know roughly about what year the first kind of MFA, mechanism was introduced, or at least brought up?
That's a good
I'll
question.
just take a stab. 2000.
Okay. Sammy, how about yourself?
Well, that seems pretty accurate. I'd imagine right around that kind of initial .com boom, somewhere around 1999, 2000, 2001 maybe.
The first patent I could find was filed in 1984.
Wow.
So a little bit older than I thought too. So I was pretty shocked by that. And it looks like it was around, like RSA, kind of in the late 80s is when it was kind of really granted and seemed to take off. So, the whole, I think like my first introduction to multi-factor when I kind of got started in IT was really, like the RSA tokens and the old little key fobs and the rolling codes and whatnot. So I think now we're lucky enough to have a lot of different options. And what's kind of cool, at least in my opinion, is, like a lot of consumer applications, like most banks are doing this now, like PayPal and, Google for Gmail and things like that. So I think it's kind of nice to see it's not just a, enterprise or IT thing anymore. It's kind of become, more mainstream, if you will. So very good stuff.
Definitely. This morning I was reading a forum about Microsoft and the global admin and what's the right thing to do there. Because in Microsoft's documentation, I think they call out that 5 global admins is kind of the max that you should ever have in a tenant, and that you should have a break glass account. Well, there's a great debate because that break glass account might not have multi-factor enabled. So
Right.
somebody brought up a great point. Well, maybe you should use something else like a UB key, some type of other token, some other type of two-factor than maybe Microsoft's authenticator. And that's a great point, right?
Yeah.
So that you have another way to get into the system. I know I have my UB key around here somewhere, but I think those are great inventions from that perspective.
Just gotta make sure your dog doesn't steal it, Brian, and then you're in trouble.
Oh, I'm just always in trouble with that dog.
That's funny. So I think the other one we wanted to cover, and this one was interesting, is FBI getting into selling encrypted phones now, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, Brian, you want to kind of give us a review of what you saw on this one?
Yeah, so basically, the FBI looks like they teamed up with the Australian Federal Police to target drug trafficking and money laundering, right? But you gotta wonder, like, is there more to this whole story at the end of the day? But there was more than 12,000 encrypted devices to over 300 criminal syndicate operating groups in more than 100 countries. So I don't know. To me, I start wondering when I was thinking about this article and kind of reviewing it this morning, I was wondering, like, is entrapment something that could even apply? And I'm the furthest thing from a legal expert or whatever in this case, but that was one of the first things that popped up in my mind, right?
Yeah. Go ahead, Brian. Derek.
Yeah. Just kind of go on that, right? I mean, I guess this is kind of an interesting one. Is the whole, I guess the whole market for encrypted secret, transmission phones is pretty small. If all these organizations essentially bought from the FBI, but if you kind of read it, it seems like really what happened, and they had a informant type of human source, if you will, that they partnered with that was already either had this kind of hardware in work or whatnot. So it doesn't seem like the FBI, kind of created everything from scratch here. They essentially kind of, probably offered some type of, plea deal, if you will. But still, it's pretty incredible source to say, that many users were using it and, talking about the various gangs, if you will. But I think what caught my eye the most is really the whole Apple factor, right? If you kind of read the article, this was their way to kind of get around the fact that some of these companies like Apple has been pretty much, very vocal about, hey, like we're not going to break our encryption for you and this and that, and they take their privacy very seriously. So I guess this is a way to kind of, do the opposite and say, hey, if you're going to use your own, secure system, if you will, we're just going to have access to everything. And, kind of always comes back to a point I always think is like, every time you watch TV, you might see some ad for, hey, use this VPN service or use this to browse safely. But at the end of the day, like whoever actually owns that kind of internal pop, if you will, that comes off, like they can see all your data, right? So this is kind of the same concept. Like, hey, the FBI had access to it; they can see everything they go, right? And then this even kind of ties back into our whole SIM swapping conversation we briefly touched on, where if someone sends you like their SIM card or a SIM card, if you will, or swaps it out, they can then decrypt and see the messaging and whatnot. So it's very interesting to see. We've had several stories now about the FBI, going in and cleaning up some of the Exchange 0 days. Now they're kind of getting involved in the whole hardware game. So we'll see what's happening here and what's coming next.
Yeah, I think you look at the whole attack back type of philosophy, and that's kind of what's happening here to some degree, right? And they're trying to stay stealth on it. And I think I read in the article that it was $120,000 that they paid the informant, and then they got $59,508 for living and travel expenses. I don't know what about the 508, but that was kind of interesting from that. Like that's not a lot of money to get somebody to.
It really seems
to jump in and do it, right?
I think they're missing a zero, in my opinion, but who knows?
Quite the community service work from that individual.
Yeah,
but it definitely speaks to the resources and capabilities of law enforcement agencies to be able to use these kind of strategies that honestly are being used by real world attackers, but against unsuspecting or innocent victims. So it's just on a much larger scale. I honestly, for me, I believe this is the tip of the iceberg for these types of offensive operations, because if you and rightfully so, to the point of Apple, that does present a security risk to all their users. So I think
Right.
this angle is a little bit more, and obviously this is up for discussion, but I think it's a little bit more ethical. But it does still trigger a privacy conversation, as this level of espionage does raise questions surrounding like ethics, because it was a legitimate organization. If you actually go look up the organization, you would see that it's recently was became inactive. But it was legitimately registered. So, as somebody who was doing research on the organization, you wouldn't have known that it was the
Right.
FBI. And I doubt unsuspecting or innocent users were using this application to have friendly conversations with their friends. It more often than not, it was probably criminals that were using it. But regardless, though, right? It does raise the questions of ethics here. And where I fall, I'm not sure, but it is quite interesting to see this kind of Trojan-like approach taken.
Yep. Well, the other thing to consider is that there is a master key, right? And so whenever there's a key like that, it's always a target for somebody to go after. And if they get that key, then they can decrypt anything, right? I mean, we saw that bringing up Colonial Pipeline again, that they got their Bitcoin. Well, not Colonial, but the attacker got their Bitcoin taken from them, right? Well, the only way that happened is they got the private key to the Bitcoin. So it's just interesting to see, like, that's how vulnerable that type of stuff is. And so who's really controlling and protecting that key?
Right.
Right.
Yeah, it's kind of very interesting timing, like you were saying. I think before we got on the show, like, hey, like this article comes out, the whole, colonial issue kind of is coming out again. So it's like, was there something, weird or fishy there? But, we never know half of these things that really happen behind, all these closed doors. It's all just speculation. But there's a lot of coincidences, I think, is happening, is what we're seeing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, something you mentioned before the podcast I thought was really interesting, Brian, when you kind of mentioned like, oh, maybe they got the private key from the anonymous app, and actually that could be very plausible with the scale that the Anom devices were spread and who was using these devices. It would make sense that it's possible that an organization like that would have transmitted keys over those devices, and that speaks to the lack of key management for that organization. So I guess they kind of need to focus on their own IT security. But regardless, yeah, that kind of push for more transparency between the communication platforms and the FBI is going to be an interesting one to kind of watch moving into the future.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's a
It's
good
a
point,
constant-
Rick. The one-time password for each message, like that would be make it a lot harder to decrypt, for sure, from that perspective.
Yeah, certainly less efficient for its users, but that's security.
It's the constant cat and mouse game, right? I mean, at some point, if we have these criminal organizations doing ransomware as a service, maybe they're going to get into the hardware game now and the hardware as a service, and hey, rent our secure, ultra secure phone or communication device as part of your ransomware package. So who knows what we're going to see in the future?
Well, I mean, you could go back to Huawei, however you pronounce it, and not allowing their equipment in the U.S. I mean, that's could be part of the whole thing, right? The fear that all that data is or some of it's going to trickle back to China, if you will.
Yeah, I think we said it many times before, but information is so powerful now, and whoever controls it is in a whole different level. So, yeah, I mean, we're so connected nowadays, and everything is so digitalized, and we're so used to doing business over the net, if you will. It's just, it's going to be bigger and bigger issue.
Yeah, I think the bar is continuing to be raised for maintaining anonymity as a criminal. Honestly, talking, but again, before the podcast, I was talking with Reese and just about how nowadays it feels like to be a criminal, you have to have some level of cyber expertise. It's almost like there is no crime without at least a efficient crime where you don't get caught without some kind of digital element to it, right? And so therefore the level of attackers just getting higher and higher. So yeah, the game of cat and mouse keeps propagating this industry, and it's really interesting to see this approach. I see the more offensive strategies by law enforcement taken every day. So I think that attack back kind of philosophy you've mentioned time and time again here, Brian, is really being executed on at the highest level.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think we can have a whole conversation just on privacy alone and what that means, and then the whole attack back is something we're seeing more and more of, and I have a feeling we're going to probably have some more of that happening here in the next few months, just with everything going on, and everything is so like kind of touchy right now. It's just like the whole global kind of climate of things and whatnot. So it's going to get pretty interesting in the next few months.
Oh yeah. I mean, lots of policy and all of that. I mean, as we look at all the different laws that are already passing, like what else is going to come next, right? And then if we're investing billions of dollars into cybersecurity at the federal government level through these infrastructure packages and all of that, I think we're going to see a huge shift in all the policy.
Yep, absolutely. All right, gentlemen. Well, I think that kind of covers some of the topics we want to go over today. For those of you watching, be sure to subscribe, hit that like button, wherever it might be, depending on your platform. Yeah, here or there. Talk to you guys in a couple of weeks, and thank you so much.
All right,
Thanks,
take
guys.
care. See you guys.